Well, I haven't done a video in a while on my 54 F100 project, and I got to this part in the project where I thought, well, I ought to document this in case somebody else wants to do it, and didn't feel like just trying to take photos and explain it. So here I'm going to do a video. So as you know, this is a low buck project, and I put a Chevy 350 in it because rebuilding that's pretty cheap, and then I had the TH350 behind it and really wanted to go with the 4-speed. So my boss, about 4 years ago, my boss, well, he had an 89 Astro van and his son rolled it, and maybe a year ago, I said, hey, how about if I get that 700 R4 transmission out of your 89 Astro van? And so I did that, and I also pulled the engine and sold it on Craigslist for him, so he got the money out of the engine. And I had to rebuild the cross member for that transmission to fit in this truck. And then just about a year ago, I finally got a drive line made up for it, and just this past summer, about 4 or 5 months ago, I got it licensed and on the road and running, so that's been fun. But no speedometer, no gauges. You know, you can get kits for those things, but they're pretty pricey. $300-400 for the gauges, and then for a speedometer, you know, maybe I could go into the transmission and redo the tail shaft to drive a cable to my speedometer, but even all those parts and the cable are expensive. So I got to thinking, I wonder if all those parts out of that Astro van, all the gauges and speedo out of that Astro van would work in my truck. So I'm going to do a little thing here on how I got the gauges to work, and maybe part 2 on how I got the speedo to work. And I'm not all done with this, but I think I'm far enough along I know how it's going to work. Over to my bench here. Explain these gauges a little bit. So this is the Astro van. Astro van cluster, and it had all 4 gauges. And what I liked about it when I first looked at it is the speedo, the sweep of it is right at about the same kind of degrees or range of degrees, and I think I could make that work in my 54 instrument cluster. Now the sweep, if the pivot for that speedo is down here, it's only about 90 degrees, whereas this is quite a bit more. But when I get to the speedo, I'll explain how this actually worked out to work out just about right. But for the clusters, okay, the clusters, first of all I had to do was get senders out of the Chevy small block engine. This right here was the temperature sender. It's just an idiot light temperature sender. I probably could have made that work with my gauges. I think I showed a photo of this. This is the gauge. This is the temp gauge. Well, I don't think I could have made this temp gauge work with just a sender. I could make an idiot light work with just the idiot light sender. Anyway, replace that with, actually I replaced it with a 2-wire sender. This is just a 1-wire. I actually ended up putting a 2-wire sender in it. This one would have worked too. The green wire on the Chevy temp gauge senders goes to the gauge, and it has a variable resistor then to ground. Oh, I had a note around here. I think on these it's about 400 ohms and higher, below 150 degrees. And then when it gets up to about 200 degrees, it has dropped to about 170, maybe 160 ohms. And I think it continues to drop. I just couldn't get it much over 200 degrees in a pot of water on the stove. But I know that this works with the Astro van temp gauge. Oil pressure gauge sender for a Chevy small block. This actually is out of an 89 S10 Blazer, but the one out of the Astro van was very similar. It's actually a 3-wire, and the wire to the gauge, I think, is a tan color, and it goes to ground, variable resistor to ground. The other 2 wires are actually normally open on low pressure, normally or closed circuit between the 2 other pins at pressure, and on the Astro van that enables the fuel pump. It could probably be made with a relay to give you an idiot light, although they had another sender here. Just a idiot light sender would probably work if you're going to do that. Anyway, I was going to put in the gauge. So I had to pull the gauges out. Now the gauge is a 4-pole wound motor, and I think the windings are about the same for all 4 gauges. It's just that the poles that are connected either to hot, negative, and the sender, which is a variable resistor to ground, are different depending on this motor. But I didn't try that out. When I salvaged the motor, the gauge out of the Astro van cluster, I traced the wires back. It's a little tricky. I had the entire wiring harness out of my boss's truck, and of course it has these multi-pin terminals that go into this printed circuit board stuff on the back of the cluster, and I just had to trace all that out to get back to which pins go to which instrument. And then I could, let's say for the fuel gauge here, I could identify on that the sender pole, negative pole, and 12-volt positive pole. Now, it just so happens that the fuel gauge sender in my tank, which is a new stainless steel tank, came with this truck, isn't working. So I'm going to go drop the tank off that 89 Astro van, get that float arm out of there with the sender off from it, and see if I can fit it to my tank. Then I will know that it will match the fuel gauge that came out of this one. Now notice also the sweep on this is about 120, 130 degrees, which happens to work pretty good with my 54. This is the fuel gauge face plate off my 54. Here is the back of it. So all I did was bend the edges of this thing, pull it off, and slip it off from the gauge. Of course, to get the motor, the gauge out of the Astro van cluster, I had to yank off the indicator. Now what I'll have to do, and I did it on all the other gauges too, is, for instance, temperature. I got this, this one just kind of flips around. I got this one hooked up to the truck and started it up, and then stuck the gauge on, just kind of stuck it in there, or the indicator, stuck it on there, down in about this position, let the thing heat up, and when it got up to temp, it was off a little bit, so I popped it off and put it back on about midpoint this faceplate doesn't have degrees on it. A lot of them don't anyway. So as soon as the stat was open and it was up about 195, I adjusted the indicator needle to be just past half. Oil pressure the same way. As soon as I turned it on, I adjusted the needle so it was down like that. And then as soon as I started it up, it climbed up, and now at idle, it's about halfway point. If I throttle the engine, rev up the engine a little bit, it'll climb up to about like that. The battery was a little easier to do because I could do it without running the truck. I could just hook this thing up, and I could show you if I should have hooked it up. And the battery, of course, only uses positive and negative, and it's basically a voltmeter, and so it will pop up about halfway at normal operating condition, a little bit above, because normally you're at 13 to 14 volts. Now, a little bit of work on this thing to adapt these instruments to this faceplate. I made first bracket I made was out of aluminum. I like using aluminum. I can cut it on a bandsaw, run it on the sander, get it all working pretty nice. There's 2 right and 2 left hands in here, and so up here on this was the fuel gauge here. I made a bracket that fits in there like that. The motor then fits in and screws to these 2 inner screws in there, and the faceplate, of course, screws on to the other side with the motor on this side. Problem with this is it was a little too thick. This is almost a 16th. I think it's 14 gauge. It's fairly thick, and the needle then, or the shaft, didn't stick out as far. So I kind of scrapped that one, or I used it as a template to draw. This is actually a right and left the way it turned out. Cut it out of some cardstock, take that, trace it onto a strip of, this is just 18 gauge, actually it might be even 20 gauge metal, trace it out, cut it out with tin snips, bend it. I made a couple jigs here, turned out to be 1.5 inch, so it's 1.5 by 2 square tubing. I put the piece of metal on there and fold it over the end, bend it down, and made another little bracket here to put over the end of it, put it in the vise, and bend that tab up. I suppose if you're into doing this, you're going to figure out some way to take some tin, cut it out, bend it up to get yourself the bracket you need to mount the gauge onto your old gauge cluster with the new faceplate. Took a little adjusting to try and get the height of the backer plate, or the faceplate, at the right height. So there's the battery in it. This is the oil pressure. I believe again, you can see where this was just an idiot light, so there's no markings on this for high and low, but I think this will work. If it's needle straight up or a little bit up to the right, I'm fine. So that thing slides in there. Oh, it's I got it fit pretty good, but when I put the needle on, it goes in too far. So I'm just going to be lazy. I could rebend these things and redo them all, but I'm going to be lazy and just put a spacer in there. Just use a next size larger nut. Get the spacer in there. Right now it's a little higher than the battery, so I don't know. See if I can get it to come down. I think the gap there. So there's battery oil. Water temperature goes up here, and the fuel gauge will go there. Can't really put this in until I get the fuel gauge sender at least on my bench and calibrate that fuel gauge. I'd like that fuel gauge to be at least bumping right at the bottom. The empty star there when the tank has, you know, a couple gallons left in it. Up on full, I don't care so much. So those are my gauges. Part 2, I think I'll do, will be the speedo that I salvaged out of this thing. That's the speedo is kind of what got me headed on this thing, and this is my truck speedo. 50 miles on my truck. Look at that, pretty nice. Too bad I'm not going to use this one. And it's got the old this cable drive, but of course the 700 R4 doesn't have a cable drive. It has the vehicle speed sensor, the VSS, and I'll show you how I've checked that out and how I'm going to make this thing work. So part 2. Now